The rain had just begun to fall when Daniel Graves pulled his car into the driveway of the old house on Blackwood Lane. It wasn't a house he had ever planned to return to. Yet, here he was, staring at the darkened windows, the peeling paint on the front door, and the overgrown grass that swallowed the pathway. His mother had died 2 weeks ago, leaving behind the house, and the memories that clawed at his mind like unseen hands. Daniel hadn't set foot inside since he was 16, but now, with his mother gone, the responsibility fell on him. Sell it, fix it, or burn it to the ground. He wasn't sure which he preferred. Stepping out of the car, he shivered. The air smelled of damp earth and something else. Something stale, like the house itself was exhaling after years of silence. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw movement behind the curtains of the upstairs window. A trick of the light, he told himself. Just nerves. The house was abandoned. At least it was supposed to be. The front door creaked open with unsettling ease, as if it had been waiting for him. The moment he stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and decayed wood filled his lungs. The furniture was exactly as it had been when he was a child. His mother's old armchair by the fireplace, the clock on the wall frozen at 3:13, and the grand staircase leading up to the rooms he had spent his childhood trying to forget. He ran his fingers over the surface of the dining table, memories rushing back, meals eaten in silence, his mother's hollow stare, the feeling that something always watched them from the darkened corners of the house. A floorboard creaked overhead. Daniel froze. The logical part of his mind told him it was just the house settling, but another part of him, the part that had never quite recovered from the nights spent lying awake in fear, knew better. He swallowed hard and turned toward the stairs. The dim light from the hallway flickered, casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. As he placed his foot on the first step, a sharp whisper cut through the silence. "Daniel." He stopped cold. The voice was barely above a breath, yet it was unmistakable. It came from upstairs, his mother's voice. But that was impossible. She was dead. He had seen her body in the casket, her lifeless face framed by the lace of her burial dress. His heart pounded as he reached into his pocket, gripping his phone like a lifeline. He could call someone, but who? The police? And tell them what? That his dead mother had just called his name? Summoning every ounce of courage, Daniel climbed the stairs, his breath shallow. The hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that led to forgotten rooms. At the end of the hall stood his mother's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. As he reached for the handle, the door swung open on its own. A gust of air rushed past him, carrying with it the scent of roses, his mother's favorite perfume. Inside the room, the bed was neatly made, just as she had left it. But something else caught his attention. On the vanity mirror, scrawled in a deep dripping red, were 3 words that made his blood turn to ice. "I never left." Daniel staggered back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The words on the mirror glistened in the dim light, the red substance thick and fresh. He reached out with trembling fingers, expecting it to be some kind of smudged lipstick or a cruel prank played by vandals. But when he touched it, the substance was warm. Too warm, and it smelled coppery, unmistakable. Blood. His breath hitched and he stumbled away from the vanity, his back hitting the wall. This wasn't possible. His mother was gone. She had been buried in the cemetery on Hollow Creek Road. He had watched as the earth swallowed her coffin. Then who had written this? A sharp tap, tap, tap echoed from the wall behind him. He spun around, his heart hammering. The noise was coming from inside the wall, a slow and deliberate tapping, like fingernails scraping against wood. He took a step closer, pressing his ear against the surface. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel swallowed hard. It was coming from inside the wall directly behind his mother's bed. His gut twisted with a sickening dread, but curiosity overpowered his fear. He reached for the old wooden paneling, his fingers tracing along the edges, until he found a loose board. With a sharp pull, it popped free, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. A rush of stale air hit him, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Squinting, he leaned forward, his phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. Something was inside, something wrapped in cloth, wedged deep into the hidden cavity of the wall. With unsteady hands, he reached in and pulled the bundle free, unraveling the layers of aged fabric. A dress, his mother's dress, a deep red, stained dark in places, and beneath it, a brittle, yellowed envelope. His name was written on the front in his mother's looping script. Daniel's hand shook as he opened it. The paper inside was fragile, the ink faded but legible. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, but I never truly left. Neither has she. You must leave this house. Do not look for the truth. Do not listen to the whispers. The walls have eyes, and they never forget. I tried to keep you safe, but it is too late now. If you hear her voice, do not answer. She will find you. And when she does, she will never let you go. His stomach lurched. His mother had known something. She had been afraid, but of what? Of who? The floor groaned behind him. A presence, cold and heavy, filled the room. The air grew thick, suffocating. Slowly, unwillingly, he turned. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a woman. Her long dark hair hung in damp strands over her face. Her dress a deep, sickening red, the same red as the one in his hands. Daniel, she whispered. The same voice from before. The same voice from his childhood nightmares. His mother hadn't been warning him about a ghost. She had been warning him about her. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the woman in the doorway took a slow step forward. Her bare feet made no sound against the wooden floor, yet the entire house seemed to groan under her presence. The dim light from the hallway flickered, casting her shadow against the walls, impossibly tall and shifting, as though it moved on its own. His body screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, unable to look away from the thing before him. Her head tilted slightly, and through the strands of wet hair, he caught glimpses of her face, pale, hollow-cheeked, her lips cracked and dark. But her eyes were the worst, sunken pits of black, gleaming like oil, pulling him into their endless void. Daniel, she said again, her voice soft, almost sweet, but layered with something else, something hungry. You came back. Daniel's mind raced. This had to be a hallucination, a side effect of exhaustion, of grief, but the scent of roses mixed with decay was too real, the cold sweat on his skin too sharp. His mother had tried to protect him, warned him not to look for the truth, but he had, and now he had found her. Who are you? His voice barely came out as a whisper. The woman took another step, and suddenly the room tilted. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, the air thickening like syrup. He staggered, gripping the vanity for support, his fingers digging into the old wood. "You don't remember?" Her lips curled into a jagged smile, her teeth blackened and sharp. "Oh, but I remember you." A memory, long buried, clawed its way to the surface. He was 8 years old. The storm outside had rattled the windows, rain hammering against the roof like nails. His mother had locked the door, whispering to him in the dark, telling him not to move, not to answer her if she called. But Daniel had been curious. He had peeked through the keyhole, and he had seen her, the woman in red standing in the hallway, calling his name. His mother had found him screaming that night. The next morning, she had sealed the door to the basement, the one place in the house Daniel had never dared to go. The woman's head twitched violently, her grin widening, stretching beyond the limits of human anatomy. "You let me in, Daniel," she whispered, "and now I'm never leaving." The walls trembled. The words on the mirror, "I never left," began to bleed, thick red streaks dripping onto the floor. The whispers in the walls grew louder, overlapping, voices calling his name in desperate, broken tones. Daniel stumbled back, his chest heaving. He had to get out. Nahush. But as he turned for the door, the woman lunged. The lights exploded, plunging the room into suffocating darkness. A cold hand seized his wrist, thin fingers like brittle bones digging into his skin. The whispering turned to screams. Then the floor beneath him gave way, and Daniel fell. Daniel hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his bones. Dust and splintered wood rained down around him as he struggled to breathe, his lungs aching from the sudden fall. The darkness was suffocating, thick as oil, pressing against his skin. A damp, rotting scent filled his nostrils, the unmistakable stench of something long buried. Groaning, he forced himself up on shaking limbs, his fingers pressing into cold, uneven stone. Where the hell was he? The floor above was gone, swallowed by shadows, the only sound the distant drip, drip, drip of unseen water. His phone. He fumbled in his pocket, the light flickering weakly to life. He was in a basement, but not just any basement. This place was old, far older than the house itself. The walls were lined with crumbling bricks, the ceiling a web of roots and decayed wooden beams. And then he saw them, the bones, piles of them, skulls, ribs, broken fingers curled into frozen agony. Some small, too small to be adults. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His mother had sealed the basement, hidden it. But why? A whisper slid through the darkness. "Daniel?" The light in his hand flickered. His breath turned to ice. And then he saw her. She stood at the far end of the basement, her body still, her hair hanging in damp, rotting strands. The dress, deep dripping red, clung to her frame like it was soaked in blood. Her arms dangled at her sides, unnaturally long, fingers twitching with each slow breath. But her face, oh God, her face, it wasn't human anymore. Her mouth stretched wide, splitting at the edges, blackened teeth lining the gaping maw. Her eyes, hollow pits of darkness, locked onto him. "You should have stayed away," she whispered, her voice layered with echoes, as if 1,000 voices spoke through her at once. Daniel stumbled backward, but the ground beneath him shifted. The bones, they were moving. The fingers twitched, the skulls turned, hollow sockets staring. She took a step forward, and the bones screamed. Daniel clamped his hands over his ears, his skull vibrating with the deafening wail. The whispers in the walls, the voices, the shadows, they had never been just the house. They had been them, The ones buried here, the ones his mother had tried to keep silent. His mother. She had known. She had tried to protect him, but she had failed. And now, it was his turn. The woman in red lunged, her arms stretching, reaching for him. Daniel ran, bones crunching beneath his feet. His phone flickered wildly, the shadows stretching, reaching. Then he saw it, an opening, a narrow passage in the stone wall, half collapsed but wide enough. He didn't think. He threw himself inside, clawing at the damp earth, forcing his way through as the screams grew louder. The moment he broke through, the house above shuddered, the ground cracked, and then silence. Daniel lay gasping in the cold night air. The ruins of Blackwood Lane behind him. The house was gone, collapsed into the earth, swallowed whole, but as he pulled himself to his feet, a soft whisper drifted through the wind. "I never left." And Daniel knew she never would.